Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today on the program, we celebrate the right to read and banned books week. No, we do not celebrate the banning and censorship and challenging of books. We want to raise awareness that in the last 5 years, there have been disturbing trends and significant upticks in these challenges and bans. We just talked to the president of the ALA who gave us the most recent numbers on that. And right now, I am very delighted to be joined by this year's Youth Honorary Chair, Julia Garnett, a dedicated advocate for freedom to read, very passionate about ensuring that young people can grow up free from censorship. Julia has worked with the National Coalition Against Censorship as a student advocates for speech leader to educate her peers on the importance of speaking out against censorship. And last year, Julia was honored for her work at the White House by none other than First Lady Dr. Jill Biden. Julia has also worked with the Trevor Project, which I'm familiar with. Very, very wonderful work there, to share her story as a queer advocate for diverse material as part of the organization's Pride in Action campaign. And Julia is at Smith College this fall with plans to major in government. Also, again, congratulations being Banned Books Week this year, their youth honorary chair. Julia Garnett, welcome to the Project Censored Show.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
I'm looking forward to our conversation. And also, we welcome Jeff Trexler. Jeff is the interim director at the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. And of course, folks that listen to the Project Censored show, the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, cbldf.org, are no strangers to that work. And I've had several graphic novelists on, graphic journalist authors, and we've covered comic banning on this program for many years. And Jeff Trexler, it's an honor to have you with us this year.
Same here. This is you do wonderful, wonderful work, and it's great to be here with both of you.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's jump right in, and let's go ahead and start with you, Julia. Let's talk about your trajectory, and your path to being this year's Youth Honorary Chair. You've been pretty busy, even at a young age, fighting for the right to read, fighting against censorship. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes, I'm often asked how I got to this position, and I always start with it's kind of a long story. And I didn't start out wanting to be an activist. I just wanted to protect books that mattered to me. And one book in particular is the book A Place Inside of Me by Zetta Elliott. It's a children's book that was in a school library in Sumner County, Tennessee, where I'm originally from. And parents and community members on both sides of the argument on if this book should be banned were kind of very divided on this issue in my county. And being the daughter of a teacher, um, my mom came home and told me that this is a book that I think you should read and you should see, why people are trying to ban it. And then I think you might want to go speak at the school board meeting and defend this book. And so I went online, I read the book, and it's such a powerful and moving story about the emotions that a young Black boy goes through after witnessing a police shooting. And there's beautiful illustrations to go along with kind of this poetic writing within the book. And so upon reading this and feeling just empathy for the character within the story, I knew how important it was that this book needed to stay on shelves in school libraries in my county. And so I went and I spoke at my first school board meeting. And I didn't know what I was walking into. And it was kind of a chaotic mess at times. I didn't know where to sit. I didn't know who to sit with. I was just me and my dad. And we went and we heard our school board members before the meeting could even start kind of talking about books and their views on a completely different book actually that they wanted banned. But I was just kind of watching my school board members and realizing that my elected officials, some of them weren't doing their jobs, and that was frustrating to me. And so I went up to the podium and I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified to go and speak, and there were so many people there. And I just remember I started, I'm a little shaky. I'm holding the podium them for dear life. But I get to this part that I'd hastily like written in while I was listening to them argue, and I told my school board members, "You are acting like children," and the room like erupts, and like there's cheering. There's also a lot of grumbling, which had been happening the whole time I was already speaking, the grumbling part. So I just it took all that fear out of me, honestly, because I realized, oh, there are people in this community who were there that I didn't realize were there to support me. And so I continued speaking. And unfortunately, they couldn't come to a majority vote at that meeting. And so there was another meeting on down the line to vote on that book all over again. But it did stay. And from there, I learned the power of my own voice as a student. And I decided to continue showing up to meetings wherever I could. And I also I had to really fight actually to be on a review committee for my high school. And so I reviewed the book, The Perks of Being a Wallflower there. And amidst all of this, I also joined the National Coalitions Against Censorship's Student Advocates for Speech program to start a club at my own high school and educate students on issues surrounding censorship in ways that we can stand up and fight them. So through all that, I also gained national recognition. I've done a lot of different news interviews, radio interviews, things like that. And I was nominated by my community for International Day of the Girl in October of 2023. And so I was invited to the White House to join a cohort of 14 other young women from across the country. And we were honored for our different areas of advocacy because we all come from different places and we have different passions, but we all are linked by that passion that like fuels us. And so I got to meet Dr. Jill Biden, honored at a ceremony within the White House, and it was just such an amazing experience. And I'm still connected with all of those young women, and we still share our accomplishments. We support each other and everything that we're doing. So it was such an honor, and I've continued to share my story on different platforms since then, and that has led up to me being the youth honorary chair.
Julia Garnett, what an absolutely inspirational story. And thank you so much for your courage and for your empathy. And realizing that that is a very powerful thing that you can channel into the public arena, to be civically engaged in meaningful ways. And the thing that struck me right from the beginning of your story was the particular book that you had mentioned and about the struggles of a young Black boy. And you don't look like a young Black boy.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm mentioning that is the stories don't have to be exactly about us or look like us in order for us to understand what's happening and how injustices occur. And in many cases, injustices are perpetuated because there isn't a Julia to go and stand up at a school board or at a library and like you said, you were at the holding onto the podium. Believe me, I've been there. Less there these days as far as the shaking part and more of the pounding part. But I still remember my early days. It's very scary to get up in front of a room like that, and especially as a young person, not knowing what's going to happen and feeling judged by your community. But I can only give you the biggest accolades for overcoming that and doing that, because you're really making a difference in your own community, and then you make a difference in the lives of other people, including people that are different than you and that you haven't even met. Right. And that's the beauty of sort of that trajectory that you seem to be on. And of course, it's not surprising to me that you seem to be interested in majoring in government because we surely need young people getting more involved in government to fix the things that are wrong with our government from the local to the national level. So, Julia Garnett, again, so inspirational. Great to hear how you've got there. We're going to come back and talk a little bit more with you. We've got quite a bit of time here left. And Jeff Trexler, let's get your path and trajectory. You are now leading the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is, gosh, I don't think it's the right phrase, but the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund for me, was always kind of why don't you put the fund in defense fund? Comic books are really important, and they were some of the first things that governments would go after, especially in the 1950s and the Cold War. And comic books they weren't taken seriously, yet they were taken seriously enough that governments and other bodies wanted to censor them and prevent young people from reading them. Let's talk about you, Jeff Trexler, and then let's segue into, why you do what you do at the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and comic books have been seen as a threat for a long time. And in many ways, the surge that we've been seeing over the past 5 years has deep roots in that movement 70 years ago. And part of the reason is, I think, what Julie was talking about in terms of there is this power in the fusion of word and image. It can make an impression on our minds. It conveys a lot of information. It has this tremendous ability to show, I think, the best and worst parts of who we are as a community, as a nation, as a world, as humanity. And I think that there's a tendency to be a bit afraid of that. I think when you see something that stark, that iconic, whether it's from a children's picture book to comic books, which really took the fusion of word and image to new heights in American culture, and was less seen as a threat to more traditional forms of literacy, more traditional media. Now, comics are everywhere. They really are a template for 21st century communication. You understand how comics work. You understand how modern communication works. And I think people, even decades later, see this as a risk. So we have enjoyed a long partnership with Banned Books Week. Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, like Banned Books Week, was started back in the 1980s when there was a surge of challenges in schools and libraries, and also directed against retail stores. We were founded after a comic shop manager was convicted for selling several comic books that are now regarded as classics. The comic book community came together as a community. It's another wonderful thing about Banned Books Week. It's another thing what's wonderful about what Julia is doing is that this is a movement that is really grassroots. It's everybody coming together to make a difference, to respond to an injustice. And in the comics community, they came together and they realized, hey, we've been dealing with this issue for decades. It's not going to go away. Let's create an ongoing way to deal with the problem. So I came on board back in 2020. I'm an attorney myself. And one of the things we've been involved in challenges, I know you mentioned when we were talking earlier before the show, that you've worked with Cameron from Katy, Texas.
Yeah, Cameron Samuels, yes.
Cameron Samuels, that was an incredible event several years ago. It was one of the early cases that we were involved in soon after I came on board. Probably the biggest one, I think people are most familiar with the work now, is our work in Virginia Beach. You may have heard of the attempt in Virginia to have genderqueer declared obscene as to minors and made illegal to sell or illegal to distribute, even to give away. Wow. In the state of Virginia. And I was counsel for the author of Genderqueer, Maya Kobabe, and we defended that book in court and successfully had the law declared unconstitutional, which has had ripple effects around the country. So the work that Julie is doing, the work that Banned Books Week is doing, and now we're all doing together in Banned Books Week, is incredibly vital to get people to see that what's happening is a real problem. It's an ongoing problem. It's a problem that has a serious impact for all, throughout all the nation and throughout every local community. And so it's wonderful to be a part of it.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for your work. Congratulations on that very important victory for Maya. Maya's been on the program before. Cameron was on with us before. There's really a great group of people that really care about protecting First Amendment rights in many different iterations, right? So I understand too that there was a series at Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, cbldf.org, US v Comics, that kind of looks at a history of this. I'm also an historian, so that struck me as very interesting. And if you could you talk a little bit kind of about, you alluded to the 70-year
this is an anniversary year.
We didn't just get here.
No, this is an anniversary year. I don't see much in the way of parties for it. I'm not sure there should be, but we did have a web series that was created by the creators of there's a free speech handbook that's in a graphic novel that is a fantastic overview of the First Amendment. and the issues that are facing everyone in the literary community today. The 70 years ago was an interesting time. So comic books in a way, the fusion of words and pictures goes back millennia, but it became a lot cheaper, a lot easier to distribute images, books that are basically printed with pictures and not just text. In the early 20th century, in the 1938, we had a character, I don't know if anybody have heard of it, but Superman was this character that really hit and took comics from being the sort of off to the side thing that maybe had been collecting Sunday newspaper strips or had some original adventures.
Jeff, is this the Superman that's faster than a speeding bullet?
Yeah, faster than the speeding bullet, that whole thing.
Please continue.
Yeah, so this became selling millions of copies every month. Immediately, there's a newspaper strip, radio shows, toys everywhere. And comic books started flooding newsstands all across the country. And no sooner were they flooding newsstands and kids were reading them everywhere, then people started saying, wait a second, if kids are reading comics, they're not reading books, or comics are lurid, comics are sensational, and most dangerously, comics damage kids' mental health and turns them into juvenile delinquents.
Yeah.
And this became the subject of actually a lot of academic inquiry. There were a number of academic articles saying how comic books corrupt kids, comic books are destroying literacy, comic books are promoting homosexuality, which back then was seen as a disorder that needed to be cured, not encouraged.
And a national security threat with the McCarran Act and others.
Yes, it was just all these problems. Yeah. And it culminated in, there was a book called Seduction of the Innocent that came out 70 years ago. And there were also Senate hearings. There were hearings in New York legislature. There were hearings in the United States Senate. And the aim was to create a federal law restricting comics because they were a source of damage to kids and
subversion. Kind of starts to sound a little HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee.
Literacy, criminality. They were a threat to democracy. This whole thing, which the industry was able to stop by creating what was called the Comics Code. You may see it looks like a stamp. You may see it still. We have T-shirts and their pins, and people still put it on the covers of like books to make it look like it's from the 1970s or 80s or 60s. And the Comics Code was this self-regulatory set of rules on things you couldn't do. Crime couldn't win. There are certain words you couldn't use on covers. For a while, you couldn't show drugs. And it stifled a lot of creativity, led to a lot of publishers shutting down, even led to a rise of underground comics, independent comics outside the mainstream distribution, because they didn't want to be subject to these rules. And it's as more free sort of communication through comics went from underground to mainstream, that the reaction against comics intensified. And even now, we're seeing the same arguments again. Virginia Beach and in Katy and elsewhere, we've seen people say that comics are a threat to literacy, comics damage mental health, comics caused all these problems for kids. And so it's 70 years later and we're still fighting the same battles.
Jeff Trexler, I can't thank you enough for continuing to fight these battles. And I think it's very important that people understand the history of these struggles, because and especially young people, people that maybe have yet to have the opportunity to learn that they're not the first people to struggle against these things. As Julia Garnett just said earlier, there is that innate fear, right? Due to inexperience that, well, what's going to happen if I speak out, and what's going to happen if I say this, but I think that history and the teaching of that history is really an integral part of emboldening and empowering particularly young people to do the things that Julia Garnett's doing now as Youth Honorary Chair for Banned Books Week. This year's theme, Freed Between the Lines, and we hope you'll look at some of the websites and the things that we're sharing today so that you can do some of that freeing between the lines yourself. Share the top 10 lists of banned books published by the American Library Association every year for your fall reading list. Spread it around your neighborhood amongst your friends, and hopefully you don't have enemies, but if you do, share it with them too. They probably need to read it. We're joined by Jeff Trexler, the interim director of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, and also Julia Garnett, who, among other things, is this year's Youth Honorary Chair for Banned Books Week. And Julia Garnett, we started with you. Let's go back to you. And you just heard Jeff give that wonderful history and the fantastic victory with genderqueer. Julia, some of your reactions maybe to some of that history, and also can you talk to us a little bit about your schedule this week? And you're already an activist, you're a student in college. What are you up to in addition to these things that you're still very active and you still have this amazing priority fighting for the right to read? Julia Garnett.
Okay, great. I guess I'd like to start with my reaction to what Jeff was talking about, because I definitely relate to when he was talking about banning graphic novels. One of the first times that I really heard the term book banning was in reference to a book my younger sister was reading, drama, because it was challenged across the country for a minor character who happened to be gay, and it wasn't even the main part of the book. And that really surprised me and my sister as well. And it was really a learning moment for us, for kind of the concept of book banning and what kind of concepts these groups were targeting. And at the same time, the book, well, you're talking about genderqueer, and and a book that also relates to that is Flamer by Mike Curato. So those two books are really primarily challenged across the country. And I think it's frustrating that sometimes in these southern states, like where I live, we don't even get the chance to have those books in our library in the first place to have them banned. But I will say in my high school, we did have Flamer. And because of the chilling effect of state library policies and Age Appropriate Materials Act, that book disappeared from our libraries rather quickly after that. So I just wanted to touch on that in my reaction to talking about graphic novels and my experience with that, because I do think that they are very heavily targeted as well. We look at the graphic novel version of The Handmaid's Tale, whereas some schools don't challenge the actual book, but they'll challenge the graphic novel because the book is kind of seen as that classic, and so they don't really put a ton of pressure all the time to challenge the book, but they'll go after the graphic novel, and a lot of times it is removed. Um, in terms of talking about my schedule for college, it's definitely an adjustment, and also not being in the South anymore. So I'm kind of transitioning to more of a role of encouraging other students to speak out, no matter where they are. And so having opportunities like this to come on and talk about my experiences, and also doing other interviews and things that I'll be doing next week in terms of speaking on different panels. I'm hoping to have the opportunity to speak on a panel with Ava DuVernay and kind of interview and talk with her about what motivates her to be such a vocal activist and things like that. I'll also be hosting my own student panel. We're still working at this time to confirm the dates and times for that, but I'm really excited to speak with students across the country about their efforts to fight censorship and kind of compare what we've been doing, and kind of come together and show other students who might be watching, and older people as well, that you can really start anywhere and you can make a difference. And I think that's something that's so important to consider, that I I really relate to the quote that one voice is the key to unlocking so many others. And so when one person speaks out, it really gives avenues for others to see that they can do that as well. And so anything that I can do to further that goal and passions of mine, including LGBTQ rights, women's rights, all kind of tie together and intersect. And so anything that I can do, I'm happy to do it to further the cause, and manage with my college schedule as well in classes. I'm actually currently in a banned book class, which is really cool, really exciting. So we're talking actually about the history of book bans and looking at some older texts that maybe aren't as commonly banned today, but looking at those reasonings. And it's so interesting how we can tie so much of the arguments of current people trying to ban books all the way back to Plato's The Republic, which is something that I hadn't thought about before. And I think that is so interesting to learn about. And I think I'm going to get so much out of this class, along with my others, taking a class on elections for government. So this is my plug to encourage everyone to register to vote and to go vote in every election. And I'm also taking a class on the intro to study of women and gender. And so looking at queer theory and feminism, it all kind of ties together, and looking at history as well. I think we can learn so much by going back and looking at the past. So I'm very excited about my schedule this semester.
I'm excited for you. I'm doing an event. We're pre-recording, and by the time people hear this show across the country, it will be Banned Books Week. I'm doing an event on my campus with an English professor that has taught on banned books for nearly a decade. Working with people in the library, always working across disciplines, as you said, very intersectional, thematically, topically, and with many different folks that have a passion for the right to have access to information, right? And it's so heartening to see people, as you said, of all walks of life and all ages. It's never too late to wake up to these ideas. But it's again, I'm very delighted to, always delighted to see young people really just have the fire and catch that bug that they have to learn more, and they want to spread that love of knowledge and love of learning. It's really such an amazing foundation for what you can do with your life, and it's also infectious. When people hear, Julia, your passion, they get excited and they think like, well, I can do these things too. And Jeff, um, people that may be cynical about, well, what can I do about that? Or these legal things, this is way too complicated and it's very difficult. Then they hear about these victories. Then
Mhm.
they hear about the history that you went over. Julia just reminded us of Plato, for goodness sake. Um, this isn't new, these struggles, and we need to be reminded of that because the struggles must continue with each generation. We can't just rest on laurels, or we can't just be defeatist about the rise. Like for the last several years, there's been a rise in this. We can't recoil in the face of this kind of adversity. That's when we need people like Julia more. That's when we need Jeff more. That's when we need Banned Books Week, ALA, and the Coalition, National Coalition Against Censorship more. That's when these groups shine and remind people why they're there in the first place. And because we live, Jeff, in the United States of America, it boggles the mind that in 2024 I still run into people that say censorship in America. What do you speak of? What do you mean? You're crazy. Jeff Trexler addressed that issue a little bit along building with what Julia Garnett was saying.
Mhm. Yeah, first, I want to say just how encouraging it is to me because we were talking a bit about the history in the 1950s. In the 1950s, if you were a youth activist, you were rounding up comics from your community and taking them to the town square and having them burned. There are photographs of this that have now become pretty infamous. So I'm glad you're not doing that, but that you've taken the other tack. And I'm also glad that you mentioned, say, drama and Flamer. We actually have a case right now involving Flamer, and we've had cases involving drama. In fact, Randa Telgemeier, the author of Drama, did a signing for us at Comic-Con, and it was just amazing to see so many young people who were committed to this work and how much of a difference it was making in their lives. And I know that they're going to go on to do great things. So I was glad to see your love of graphic novels. We're not immune to things in America. America has had these very interesting tensions throughout its history. There is this love of freedom, and there is also this deep moral streak, which sometimes can show itself in some good ways, and other times can show itself in the town people coming together, getting their pitchforks and tossing off the thing that they think
Torches.
is their torches. And there's a reason in shows like South Park, one of the recurring themes is the people coming together to cast out some person, to cast out something, to blame something for their troubles.
Scapegoating.
It's a deep problem that we have, and the only way we're going to keep it from overwhelming us is for all of us to come together to make a difference and put a stop to it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jeff Trexler. And we actually at Project Censored, the Censored Press, we're also publishers now. Adam Bessie is a great colleague of mine. He's taught English. He teaches courses on banned books. His book was called Going Remote: A Teacher's Journey, that he did with Portland artist Pete Glanting, that talks about the struggles of teaching during the pandemic, the pros and cons of technology, the surveillance and censorship that comes along with that. It kind of, and it's a graphic journalism, graphic nonfiction. It's actually gotten some attention, but it also gets the pushback of, and he's talked about this on this program before, of how comics was seen as a non-serious kind of art form, yet simultaneously it drew the great ire of these moral panics, driving these moral panics. So it's kind of a very contradictory kind of relationship that we have with things like comics, with graphics. But you were just at Comic-Con not
Mhm.
long ago, and I'm curious to this, and I want to flip it over to Julia in a moment too. Could you share with our listeners and viewers on YouTube, what was your experience with engaging the people there, and in terms of how attuned or how hip are some of the people at Comic-Con, which are amazingly well attended,
Mhm.
right? How do you do there when you're paneling? I mean, what's the reception?
Uh, Comic-Con in many ways gives me the energy to get through the rest of the year. You go through these battles, whether it's in court or you're talking to people in schools, local communities, dealing with trying to keep a retailer out of jail, and you know, it can get a bit wearing. There's all this stuff that happens, even with the victories. There's a lot of hard work that has to be done, and you go to Comic-Con, and there is such an outpouring of love, of conviction, of belief and understanding in what you do, of what you do. It is um, it's truly an amazing experience to hear parents, to hear kids, to hear college students. We have a number of college students and law school students who volunteer for us,
Hmm.
and to see their enthusiasm, and also just to see how much they get it. So you talked about how comics aren't being seen as serious, right? And we saw that in Texas. We're seeing that around the country. You talked about remote education. Parents who see their kids were reading graphic novels at school, or their kids are being taught it in classes, and they say, "Well, we sent our kids to learn how to read, to learn how to do things. This is nonsense." But what people at Comic Con get is that the new literacy requires how you have to understand how to communicate through images. You have to understand how what we say can connect to what we show, what we see, the pictures. They understand that if they want to put together good YouTube videos, they want to storyboard it, right? Or PowerPoints, they want to storyboard it. Uh, they do their own animations, they illustrate things, TikToks. I had my college students who grew up sort of with comics as sort of the heart of how they read and how they learned how to see the world. Were showing me, we understand how to do TikToks better than you, Jeff, because we're in this in a way
Yeah,
that you
yeah.
don't.
The people at Project Censored that do that are all out of college, younger
Yeah,
people. They run our TikTok, they run
yeah.
our Instagram.
They they get it. They see comics as the gateway to personal fulfillment and professional success.
Absolutely.
And to be in that atmosphere for 5 days is it's tremendous.
That's amazing. And it's an amazing segue, to see that kind of work. And I mean, again, because when sometimes people think that, they just think the Marvel, and I'm not saying there's no good stories there, but the corporatization of and the Hollywoodizing of this kind of thing kind of overshadows it. But Comic-Con is so much more than
Mhm.
all of that. And the world of graphic novels and graphic nonfiction is so broad and so much more. And it's such an incredible entry point for so many people, just like comics were back in the day of Superman, right, Jeff?
Mhm. Yeah,
It's
yeah.
amazing.
People come, Marshall McLuhan, there's a media theorist,
Yep,
came up
yep.
with the phrase, the medium is a message. He talks about how comics are a participatory medium. So you just want to read them, you want to engage with them in some way, you want to write your own, you want to draw pictures, you want to cosplay, or you want to defend them. It's a wonderful medium, and conventions are, we're going to be at New York Comic Con in a few weeks. Conventions are a way we can all come together and make a difference. Even local libraries are having Comic Cons.
Yep,
Colleges are having Comic Cons.
yep.
It's a gathering of the community that care.
Yeah, they're all over the country. I mean, I know some of them are more well known than others, but they're everywhere, even in the Northern California and
Mhm.
some of the smaller places in Sonoma County. We've had amazing events. They seem to be they seem to be gaining traction, which is a really good thing. And to me, it's really about media literacy and multiple literacies. And one of the things
Yeah.
we do at Project Censored is teach critical media literacy. And anti-censorship is a big part of that. So people are subject to many different ideas. And Julia Garnett, let's bring you back in for the last word, so to speak, in this segment. Um, Resonating on some of the things here that maybe Jeff is saying. I don't know if you have any involvement in the Comic-Con world, or graphic books or graphic novels or any of those things. So I just figured I'd throw it over to you. And I mean, what was it that kind of hooked you to really, being a reader, into being somebody that was just into text and images, and really this passion for learning?
Well, I did mention that I have a mom who is a teacher, so I
Uh-huh.
didn't really have a choice. She
You did,
started
though.
reading.
You did have a
I
choice
mean,
and you
I
made
guess.
one.
I did. She started reading to me when I was really little, so I've just always been surrounded by so many books, and I'm so lucky to have that opportunity to really grow up valuing being able to read and being surrounded by books, so that when if I didn't have access to information, I could kind of go out and find it. So we were really open in my family about that and asking questions. However, I will say what really hooked me to fighting book banning, besides just wanting to protect young people's ability to empathize with texts that maybe they haven't experienced before, would be growing up as a queer student and not having access to books with queer representation because they either didn't really exist or weren't really out there for me to easily access. And so I kind of grew up feeling isolated, feeling different. And that caused a lot of confusion. And it wasn't until my best friend came out in middle school that I kind of was like, oh, it's okay. Like this is okay. This is something about myself that I recognize. And through that realization, I began to seek out books that would kind of reflect my experience with queer identities. And so I've been so lucky, find so many great books that are challenged a lot of the time, but that I can really reflect with. So I've really taken to fighting book bans of books of all natures because it's so important to me that students are able to read texts that they can identify with, they can recognize themselves within, but then they can also kind of look through the window into someone else's life and see experiences that other people have been through and be able to empathize with that because that's how we learn, that's how we grow as people. And without that, there's such a lack of connection, and I think that's something that sometimes online media can't give us, and that's why reading is so important for me to be able to promote. And I think with book banning it kind of works in the opposite effect because when you're trying to ban a book, you're just bringing more attention to that said book. The book Lawn Boy was removed from my high school, and no one was really reading it. But after they removed it, 40 kids came to the library and asked to check it out. And that starts conversations. And that,
Yep.
really causes people to want to read whatever material. So I guess I'd like to end with an idea, though, that kind of scares me almost more than public book banning. And I think it's something that's not really talked about a ton. And that would be, I kind of alluded to it before, but states are passing stricter age appropriate materials laws.
Yep.
And that scares me more because librarians are kind of quietly having to pull books and it's not their fault at all. It's they're afraid for their jobs, they're afraid for the repercussions of communities because we are seeing communities kind of or parts of communities come together and accuse librarians of giving pornography to children. And so it's not their fault, but books are disappearing quietly. And I've kind of termed it in interviews and when I'm talking, I'm calling it like phantom book banning because it's not public. But these books are quietly disappearing. And it's so terrifying to me, this idea that we don't know about the books to be able to go and read them. And so they're just kind of quietly, disappearing off the shelves. So I guess I'd like to kind of end my talking on this section with that idea that we have to be aware and we have to pay attention and we have to call into question these state laws that are kind of just slipping through and we're not really talking about them maybe as much as we should because this isn't just a Tennessee problem. This is this is a nationwide problem that we're seeing.
Oh, Julia Garnett, absolutely. Half the states, are trying to do these things. It's not just Florida and Texas or Tennessee. It's not just the stop wokeness and these types of things. It's happening all over the place and often in smaller communities that are news deserts where there's not a lot of local news or information. And it takes people committed of any age, but often students or librarians on the front lines to call attention, to ring the alarm bell. And Julia Garnett, again, you've given us so many reasons to celebrate this year's theme for Banned Books Week, freed between the lines, right? And what's at stake here if we don't really fight against book bans and censorship and fight for the right to read. Julia Garnett, anything you want to share with people about any place to follow you or your work or websites or anything you want to share with people? You don't have to, but I'm just giving you the opportunity if you do.
I guess I always just like to end interviews with the idea for young people who might not know where to begin with activism or advocacy that you can start anywhere. And you're also not alone. And there are people across the country, either in person or online, that can and will support you. You just kind of have to seek out those resources. A great place to start is National Coalition Against Censorship. Love to support them. And, we're not going to win every battle, but there are books that will be banned. And I think that it's important for us to regroup after that and to continue pushing forward, continue reading these books. So I would like to end with that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Youth Honorary Chair this year for Banned Books Week, Julia Garnett. And Jeff Trexler, back to you. Same concluding possibilities here for taglines. Any places you want to maybe send people? Of course, we've mentioned the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund site, but anything else you'd like to share here as our last words?
Yeah, and just a note of encouragement, building on what Julia said, which is there are a lot of battles. We will lose some battles, but I'm convinced that in a way we've already won the war. Just like Plato was calling for the censorship of poetry, uh, poetry won, right? People tried to ban comics in the 50s. Comics became the new mainstream. They're fighting against sort of the new ways of communication and new messages that we find in books today.
The Parents Music Resource Center in the
Yeah.
80s tried to ban music and heavy metal and heavy metal and rap won.
Yeah. It's important to fight these battles, but I think it's also important not to feel defeated and overwhelmed, because I do believe that culture and history are on our side. If people want to, if anything's happening in their community, they should definitely reach out to us. We're at cbldf.org. If that ever seems confusing, Comic Book Legal Defense Fund.org. It's just the acronym. Please, if there's any way we can help with the challenge to graphic novels, manga, animation, gaming, anything in your area, reach out to us. And if you'd like to volunteer, we're building a volunteer network. I'll be getting back in touch with everybody very, very soon. And we could use your help, whether you're an attorney, whether you do web design, whether you are a student who wants to help in your community, and just everybody. I like to say, from pastors to plumbers, students, everybody. We want to bring them to bear in the community to be a force for good, be a force for change, be a force for freedom, and we want to help you do that. So thanks to you, thanks to Julia. There are a lot of good things happening.
Jeff Trexler, it's true, and we need to all do it in unison together. It has been such an honor talking to you, Julia Garnett, and to you too, Jeff Trexler, Interim Director of Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. And of course, you can learn more at bannedbooksweek.org. And Project Censored's been in the game for a bit too. You can go to projectcensored.org and see our banned books page.